They called her the Ghost of Greyfall. Not to her face, of course. To her face, they called her nothing at all. She was a smudge in the corner of their vision, a flicker of movement in the periphery, the silent girl who scrubbed the flagstones until her knuckles were raw and bleeding. Her name was Alara, but she had not heard it spoken with kindness in a decade. The cold was a living thing in the great hall. It seeped through the stone floor, a malevolent chill that bit at the frayed hem of her tunic and sank its teeth deep into her bones. Her breath plumed in the air, a fleeting ghost of her own. Her hands were numb. The icy water in the bucket had long since lost any memory of warmth. Each dip and wring of the rag was a fresh agony, a sharp, stinging pain that shot up her arms. She ignored it. Pain was a constant companion, as familiar as the gnawing emptiness in her belly. She kept her eyes down, focused on the swirling patterns of grime on the stone. It was safer that way. To look up was to risk meeting someone's gaze, and to be seen was to be judged. To be judged was to be punished. Her parents had been exiles, taken in by the Greyfall pack out of a reluctant pity that had curdled into resentment after their deaths. They had left her with nothing but their shame, a debt she was forced to repay with every sunrise, on her hands and knees. She was an omega, less than nothing, a creature of hollow bones and silent obedience. That was her purpose. A pair of fine leather boots stopped inches from her bucket, splattering dirty water onto their pristine surface. Alara froze. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage of ice. Filth. A voice dripped from above, sweet as honey and sharp as glass. Lyra. Alara did not look up. She squeezed her eyes shut, praying for invisibility, for the floor to swallow her whole. "Did you not hear me, ghost?" Lyra's voice was closer now. The scent of winter roses and smug superiority filled the air. "You've soiled my boots." A lie. Alara had seen the splash. The water had barely touched the heel. But the truth did not matter. Her truth never did. I am sorry," she whispered, the words scraping her throat raw. Sorry is not good enough. A sharp kick connected with the bucket. Icy, filthy water sloshed over Alara's legs, soaking through her thin trousers, a shock of cold so intense it felt like fire. She gasped, biting back a cry of pain. The cold was immediate and brutal. "Look at the mess you've made," Lyra tisked, a sound of feigned disappointment. "Now you will have to do it all over again, and do it properly this time." Laughter echoed from nearby. Lyra was never alone. Her sycophants, other high-born wolves, gathered like vultures to watch the sport. Alara felt their eyes on her, hot and sharp with scorn. Humiliation burned in her chest, a toxic heat that warred with the freezing water on her skin. Her hands trembled, not just from the cold, but from a deep, primal rage she had learned to smother before it could ever draw breath. She gritted her teeth. The pressure in her jaw was a familiar anchor in a sea of degradation. She would not cry. She would not give them the satisfaction. She reached for her rag, her movements stiff and slow. The water was a spreading stain on the stones she had just cleaned, mocking her efforts. Her work was undone, just like her, always undone. Pathetic, Lyra sneered, turning away. The show was over. The boots clicked away, their sound a sharp punctuation to Alara's misery. Alara stayed there for a long moment, kneeling in the puddle of her own failure. The cold was beginning to burn, a deep, aching fire in her skin. But beneath the pain, a tiny, stubborn ember refused to be extinguished. She would finish. She would clean the floor. She would get up. It was a small rebellion, one that nobody would ever see. But it was hers. She took a shuddering breath, the frigid air a knife in her lungs, and began to scrub again. The world had done its best to break her, but it had not succeeded. Not completely. Not yet. The wind began to howl in the late afternoon, a mournful cry that rattled the shutters of the hold. It was an unnatural sound, edged with a predatory snarl that made the hairs on Alara's arms stand up. The pack elders muttered by the hearth, their faces grim. A white squall, they called it, a storm born of malice, not of nature. No one was to go outside, which was, of course, the moment Lyra chose to corner her in the kitchens. "The Alpha's firewood stores are low," Lyra said, her arms crossed. Her eyes held a cruel glint. "Someone needs to go to the woodpile and bring more in." The kitchen servants exchanged nervous glances. The woodpile was at the very edge of the clearing, 100 yards from the relative safety of the hold. "But the elders said," one of the cooks began. "The elders are not in charge of me," Lyra cut in smoothly. "And our Alpha needs his fire. Are you saying his comfort is less important than a little wind?" She turned her gaze on Alara, a predator singling out the weakest of the herd. "You, ghost, you are doing nothing. Go." It was a death sentence. Alara knew it. They all knew it. But to refuse a direct order from an alpha born like Lyra was to invite a punishment far worse than a storm. Without a word, Alara pulled a threadbare cloak around her shoulders and slipped out the kitchen door. The world outside was a maelstrom of white. The wind sliced like claws, stealing the breath from her lungs and driving needles of ice into any exposed skin. Snow didn't fall. It flew horizontally, a blinding, churning wall of white that erased the world. She bent her head, pulling the hood low, and pushed forward into the storm. The hold vanished behind her in 2 steps. She was alone in a roaring, featureless void. Panic, cold and sharp, tried to claw its way up her throat. She fought it down. The woodpile. Just get to the woodpile and back. But the storm was a disorienting beast. Every direction looked the same. The familiar path was buried under feet of fresh, whipping snow. Was it this way or that? She stumbled on, her feet growing heavier with each step, the cold seeping deeper, making her thoughts sluggish. The roar of the wind was deafening, a constant, crushing pressure. She thought she saw the dark shape of the woodpile through the swirling snow and pushed toward it with a surge of desperate hope. Her foot came down on what she thought was solid ground. It was not. A sickening crack echoed, swallowed instantly by the wind. The ground gave way. Ice. She was on the frozen river. For a heart-stopping second, she was falling. Then, the universe became a symphony of absolute, shocking cold. The water was a physical blow, a liquid ice that stole all the air from her body in a single, violent gasp. It was black and impossibly, brutally cold. It sucked her down, her waterlogged cloak wrapping around her legs like a shroud, dragging her into the dark. Her mind screamed. Thrashing, she fought against the pull of the cloak, her numb fingers fumbling with the clasp. The current was a monster, tumbling her over and over in the crushing darkness beneath the ice. This is it. This is how I die. The thought was strangely calm, a single point of clarity in the chaos. Alone, in the cold and the dark, unseen, unmourned. Just as the last of her fight began to ebb, her lungs burning for air she did not have, a tremendous force slammed into the ice above her. Once, Twice, a crack of thunderous sound penetrated the watery silence. Light, fractured and pale, lanced through the darkness. A third impact and the ice shattered. Something immense and powerful plunged into the water beside her. A massive shape, all teeth and fur and primal fury. A wolf. But it was bigger than any wolf she had ever seen. It was a beast of legend, its fur the color of shadow and snow, its eyes burning with a faint internal light. Its teeth, long and sharp as daggers, clamped onto the collar of her tunic. It was not a savage bite, but a firm, decisive grip. With a heave of impossible strength, it dragged her from the river's killing embrace, hauling her up onto the broken shelf of ice. Alara lay there, coughing up freezing water, her body convulsing in violent, uncontrollable shivers. She was dying. The cold was inside her now, freezing her blood, stopping her heart. The great wolf stood over her, a mountain of dark fur against the white storm. Water streamed from its coat, freezing instantly into crystals of ice. It lowered its massive head, nudging her with its nose, a low growl rumbling in its deep chest. Was it a growl of aggression or concern? She was too cold to tell. Her vision was tunneling, the roaring of the wind fading to a distant hum. Black spots danced before her eyes. The wolf seemed to sense her fading. It nudged her again, harder this time, then shifted. Its form seemed to dissolve and reform in the blinding snow, bones cracking and reshaping with a sound that vibrated through the ice. Where the beast had stood, a man now knelt. He was as immense as the wolf had been, broad-shouldered and powerful, his bare skin steaming in the frigid air. His hair was black as a starless night, wild and dusted with snow. But it was his eyes that captured her, that held her on the very edge of consciousness. They were the color of molten gold, and they glowed with their own fierce light. He reached for her, his large hands surprisingly gentle as he gathered her into his arms. The contact was a jolt, a shock of warmth that had nothing to do with temperature. The moment his skin touched hers, the world exploded. It was not a sound, but a feeling, a cataclysm of energy that erupted from the point of contact, searing through her veins like lightning. White-hot fire raced up her arm, burning away the deadly cold, chasing the shadows from her vision. A cry tore from her throat, raw and involuntary. Pain, pleasure, power. It was all of it at once. She looked down at her own wrist where his hand held her. On her pale skin, a mark was burning itself into existence. It was a complex, beautiful pattern of light, like a sun made of intricate frost, glowing with an ethereal silver-blue luminescence. The man, the Alpha King, her mind supplied from some deep, instinctual place of knowing, looked down at the mark, then back at her. His golden eyes widened, blazing with an emotion so intense it was terrifying. It was shock, disbelief, and a profound, soul-shaking recognition. A single word left his lips, a sound deeper than thunder, a rumble that vibrated through her very soul. You. Alara stared at him, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs. Who was he? What was happening to her? The mark on her wrist pulsed with a gentle warmth, a living thing that seemed to connect her to him, a current of energy flowing between them. Her body, which should have been terrified of this huge, powerful stranger, felt a strange and inexplicable pull towards him. It was a feeling of safety, of coming home to a place she had never known, a sense of rightness that defied all logic. But her mind, The part of her that had been trained for 2 decades in fear and submission screamed. It shrieked at her to run, to hide, to make herself small and invisible. This was a king, an alpha of alphas. He was power incarnate, and she was nothing. No, she whispered, the word a puff of frozen air. She tried to pull her arm away, but his grip was like iron. "It is you," he said again, his voice softer this time, filled with a sense of awe that made no sense. He looked at her as if she were a miracle he had stopped believing in. "I have been searching." Searching? For whom? For her? The idea was so preposterous it was almost laughable. No one had ever looked for her, let alone searched. She was the ghost, the forgotten one. He shifted his grip, his thumb stroking over the newly formed mark. The touch sent another wave of heat through her, a dizzying, pleasant warmth that made her shiver for an entirely different reason. "Mine," he murmured, the word a possessive, absolute claim that echoed in the marrow of her bones. It should have terrified her. It did terrify her. But it also resonated with a part of her soul she hadn't known existed. A lonely, hollow place that suddenly felt seen. He scooped her up into his arms as if she weighed nothing. His body was a furnace against her frozen one. He wrapped his own thick, fur-lined cloak around her, cocooning her in his scent. A wild, clean smell of pine, winter storms, and something else, something uniquely him. "Hold on," he commanded, his voice gentle but firm. He began to move through the blizzard, not with the stumbling uncertainty she had shown, but with a purpose and power that defied the storm. The wind seemed to part for him. The snow could not blind him. He was a force of nature more powerful than the squall itself. Alara lay against his chest, her head spinning with confusion and fear. The bond, or whatever it was, thrummed between them. A silent conversation her mind could not comprehend, but her body understood perfectly. It spoke of loneliness and longing, of centuries of waiting, of a sudden, explosive completion. What was happening? This was impossible. She was Alara, the Omega, the worthless one. And this was a king, the Alpha King, Kaelin. His name bloomed in her mind unbidden. He carried her to a small, hidden cave, a fissure in a rock face she had never known existed. Inside, it was sheltered from the wind, the oppressive roar of the storm muted to a distant sigh. He set her down gently near the back wall, his golden eyes never leaving her face. He moved with an unnerving grace, building a fire with a speed and efficiency that was mesmerizing. Within moments, flames licked at the dry wood he seemed to produce from nowhere, casting a warm, flickering light across the stone walls. The heat felt incredible, but it was nothing compared to the warmth that still radiated from the mark on her wrist, a constant, comforting presence. Kaelin sat back on his haunches before her. He did not speak, merely watched her, his expression a mixture of fierce protectiveness and profound wonder. He looked at her as if she were the most precious thing in the world. It was too much. The intensity of his gaze, the impossible events, the brand on her skin. It was all a terrible, beautiful dream. "Why?" she finally managed to ask, her voice a reedy whisper. "Because you are my mate," he answered simply, as if it were the most obvious truth in the universe. "The other half of my soul, the one I was made for." His words struck her dumb. Mate, soul. The concepts were from fairy tales, from stories told to high-born children, They had nothing to do with her. Such things were not meant for the likes of Alara. She shook her head, pulling her knees to her chest, trying to hide the glowing mark from his sight, from her own. "You are mistaken. I am no one." A low growl rumbled in his chest. It was not threatening, but full of a deep, resonant frustration. "You are not no one. You are everything." He reached out, his fingers gently tilting her chin up so she was forced to meet his blazing eyes. "They blinded you to what you are. They will not keep you blind any longer." Outside the cave, hidden behind a snow-laden pine, a pair of dark eyes watched the firelight flicker. Lyra had followed the tracks, not Alara's, which had been wiped clean by the storm, but the tracks of the great wolf. She had seen it drag the pathetic Omega from the river. She had seen the impossible transformation. And through a crack in the rock, she saw the glowing mark on Alara's wrist. A soul bond with the Alpha King. A wave of cold, venomous jealousy washed over Lyra, far colder than the storm. That should have been her. She was Alpha-born, beautiful, powerful. Not this scrap of nothing. She saw the way the king looked at Alara, with a reverence and adoration that no one had ever shown Lyra. It was a look that promised power, status, a throne. A look that was being wasted on an Omega ghost. Rage, pure and sharp, burned in her gut. This could not be allowed. This would not be allowed. The worthless girl would not rise above her. Lyra knew exactly who to tell. Lord Malachor, the ambitious Alpha from the southern peaks, the leader of the shadowy Ember Covenant. He had been whispering promises of power to her father for months, speaking of a new order, of deposing the ancient king. Malachor would know what to do with this information. He would see the girl not as a future queen, but as a weapon, a weakness in the king's armor. A cruel smile twisted Lyra's lips. She backed away from the cave, silent as a shadow, her mind already racing. Alara's brief, impossible dream of a new life was about to become a nightmare. And Lyra would be the one to orchestrate it. The next hours passed in a surreal haze for Alara. Kalen tended to her, his large hands surprisingly deft as he stripped her of her soaking wet rags and wrapped her in his own dry, warm cloak. He produced dried meat and hard bread from a pack she hadn't noticed, insisting she eat. She obeyed numbly, her mind still reeling. Every time her gaze fell upon the glowing mark on her wrist, a fresh wave of disbelief washed over her. It pulsed with his proximity, a soft, warm thrum that felt like a second heartbeat. He spoke to her in that deep, rumbling voice, telling her of his long search, of the ancient prophecy that foretold a mate with a spirit of ice and light who would restore balance to the shifting world. He spoke of a loneliness that stretched across centuries, a hollow ache in his soul that was now, finally, gone. She listened, but the words felt as if they were about someone else, a powerful, mythical queen. Not her. Not the girl who scrubbed floors. How could he not see the grime still under her fingernails, the worthlessness etched into her very bones? "You are tired," he said, his golden eyes soft with concern. "Rest. I will keep watch." Exhaustion, both physical and emotional, was a heavy weight on her limbs. She wanted to argue, to deny his right to command her, but she had no strength left. She curled up by the fire, the fur of his cloak soft against her skin, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, feeling safer than she had in her entire life. She awoke to the sound of snarling. Her eyes snapped open. The cave was dim, the fire burned low. Kalen was on his feet at the entrance, his body a tense silhouette against the gray morning light. He was no longer looking at her with tenderness, but with the cold, deadly focus of a predator. "Show yourselves," he commanded, his voice a low, lethal growl that promised violence. Figures emerged from the snow-dusted trees. They were dressed in black leather and dark steel, their faces grim. On their chests, they bore the sigil of a smoldering ember, the Ember Covenant. And at their head stood a tall, gaunt man with eyes like chips of obsidian, Lord Malachor. Behind him, smirking with triumph, was Lyra. Alara's blood ran cold. Lyra, of course. "Kalen," Malachor greeted, his voice a smooth, oily sound that slid over the snow. "Hiding in a cave? It is beneath you, and with such common company." His dead eyes flickered to Alara, a dismissive, contemptuous glance that made her skin crawl. "What do you want, Malachor?" Kalen's voice was flat, devoid of any warmth. "What every ambitious man wants. A better world, a new order." Malachor smiled, a thin, cruel slash of a mouth. "But for now, I will settle for her." He nodded towards Alara. "The little Omega who bears your mark." A fascinating development. Lyra was most informative. Lyra preened under the attention, her gaze locking with Alara's, full of triumphant spite. "See," her eyes said, "you will never escape what you are." Kalen took a step forward, a low growl building in his throat. "You will not touch her." "Oh, I think I will," Malachor said calmly. "You see, you have a choice. Surrender her to me, and your precious people will be spared the war that is coming. Refuse, and my forces will burn their way from here to your throne room, starting with the Greyfall pack." Alara's heart stopped. He was threatening her pack. The people who had tormented her, yes, but they were all she had ever known. "They would be fools to side with you," Kalen snarled. "Perhaps," Malachor conceded. "But fear is a powerful motivator, and I have something you do not. A key." He gestured again to Alara. "Prophecy says your mate's power can be transferred. Sever the bond, claim the power. A king's strength added to my own. Imagine it." The casual cruelty of his words, the idea of him tearing this fragile new thing from her, sent a spike of pure terror through Alara. Before Kalen could answer, Malachor's men moved. They were fast. They threw small dark orbs that exploded on the ground, releasing a thick, acrid smoke. At the same time, two of them lunged, not at Kalen, but at Alara. Kalen roared, a sound of pure fury, and shifted. The massive black wolf exploded into being, a whirlwind of claws and teeth. He tore into the Covenant soldiers, but the smoke was thick, disorienting. A hand clamped over Alara's mouth. An arm like a steel band wrapped around her waist, lifting her off the ground. She tried to scream, to fight, but she was weak, powerless. Through the swirling smoke, she saw Kalen fighting, a force of primal rage. But there were too many. Another soldier threw a heavy chain net. It was silver. The moment the gleaming metal touched Kalen's wolf form, he howled in agony, smoke rising from his fur where it made contact. He thrashed, but the silver sapped his strength. "Kalen!" she cried, her voice muffled by the hand over her mouth. Her captor was dragging her away, back into the snow. The last thing she saw was Kalen, trapped in the silver net, his glowing golden eyes fixed on her, filled with a desperate, helpless fury. Then the trees obscured her view. She was bundled onto a horse, her hands bound in front of her with cuffs made of the same gleaming, cold silver. The metal burned her skin, a deep, biting cold that seemed to suck the warmth right out of her. The mark on her wrist, once a source of comfort, now flared with a sharp, agonizing pain. The pain was not just her own. Through the bond, she could feel him, his rage, his agony from the silver, and a desperate, clawing pain from their forced separation. It was a cold, sharp ache that settled deep in her chest, a physical manifestation of a tearing soul. They rode for what felt like days, though she knew it was only hours. They traveled to a dark, jagged fortress perched on a windswept mountain peak, Malakor's stronghold. She was dragged from the horse and thrown into a cell. It was deep underground, carved from black rock, lit by a single sputtering torch. The air was cold and damp and smelled of despair. Her silver chains were secured to a ring on the wall. The cold of the metal was relentless, a constant drain on her energy. The bond was a thin, frayed thread, stretched taut across the distance, pulsing with a shared, unending pain. Hope, a fragile seedling that had just begun to sprout in the warmth of Kaelin's presence, withered and died. Lyra had been right. She could never escape what she was. A pawn, a tool, a thing to be used and discarded. The door to her cell creaked open. Malachor stood there, his obsidian eyes gleaming in the torchlight. "Comfortable?" he asked, his voice dripping with false concern. Alara said nothing, only glared at him from where she was huddled on the floor. "Your king is indisposed," he continued, pacing before her. "The silver takes its toll, but he is strong. He will come for you, and that is precisely what I am counting on." He stopped and crouched down to her level. "You feel it, don't you? The bond, tearing. It is a fascinating piece of magic, a tether between two souls. But like any tether, it can be cut. And when it is, the power it holds must go somewhere." He reached out and touched the mark on her wrist with a single, cold finger. The pain intensified tenfold, a white-hot agony that made her cry out. "Such a unique signature," he mused, a flicker of genuine curiosity in his dead eyes. "Not just the fire of a shifter, but something else. Something cold, something bright. When that power is mine, Kaelin will not stand a chance. I will become a god." He stood up, smiling down at her. "The ritual will begin at moonrise. I do hope your king arrives in time to watch." He turned and left, the heavy door booming shut, plunging her back into near darkness. Despair washed over her, a black, suffocating tide. He was going to kill her. He was going to steal this beautiful, terrifying thing inside her and use it to destroy the one person who had ever looked at her and seen someone worthy. She pulled at the silver chains, but they only bit deeper into her flesh, the cold burning like acid. The pain in the bond was a constant, throbbing misery. She could feel Kaelin's frantic struggle, his desperation, his pain mirroring her own. Worthless. The word echoed in her mind, in Lyra's sneering voice. She was worthless. Too weak to fight, too weak to save herself, too weak to be the queen this ancient, powerful king deserved. Tears streamed down her face, freezing on her cheeks. She squeezed her eyes shut, her body trembling with cold and fear. It was over. And then she felt it. A flicker. Deep within the cold agony of the bond, a tiny spark of warmth ignited. It was a pinprick of light in an ocean of darkness. It was him. Hold on. The voice was not a sound. It was a thought, a feeling, projected directly into her mind through their frayed connection. It was his voice, deep and resonant and full of unwavering resolve. Alara, hold on. Hope, stubborn and defiant, flared back to life. He was coming. He was fighting his way to her. I am coming for you. The promise echoed in her soul. She wasn't a pawn. She was his mate, and he was coming. She opened her eyes, the tears freezing on her lashes. She looked at the silver chains binding her. She looked at the stone walls. She was not worthless. She was the mate of the Alpha King. And she would not make it easy for them. She would hold on. The hours crawled by, each one an eternity of cold and pain. The bond remained a thin, aching line, but his presence was a constant reassurance at the other end of it, a silent promise that pulsed with his unrelenting will. When the guards finally came for her, she did not fight. She saved her strength. They dragged her from the cell and up winding stone stairs to the highest tower of the fortress. The ritual chamber was a circular room, open to the night sky where a full, icy moon hung like a judgmental eye. The floor was covered in complex runes, drawn in what looked disturbingly like fresh blood. In the center was a stone altar. Malachor was waiting, flanked by robed acolytes of his Ember Covenant. Lyra stood near him, her face alight with a vicious, eager excitement. Alara was forced onto the altar, her silver chains pulled taut and locked to the stone. She lay on her back, exposed and vulnerable beneath the cold moonlight. The moon is at its apex, Malachor announced, his voice echoing in the chamber. The celestial energies are aligned. Let the severing begin. The acolytes began to chant, a low, guttural sound that vibrated through the stone. The runes on the floor began to glow with a sickly red light. Malachor raised a black obsidian knife, its edge shimmering with dark magic. The pain in the bond intensified, no longer a dull ache, but a sharp, shearing agony, as if a blade were physically trying to saw through her soul. She screamed, the sound torn from her throat. And then, a roar of pure, world-breaking fury shattered the night. The wall of the tower exploded inward. Stone and debris flew as a colossal black wolf, eyes blazing with golden fire, tore into the chamber. Kaelin. He was a blur of motion, a force of nature unleashed. Covenant soldiers fell before him, their screams cut short by snapping jaws and raking claws. Behind him, his elite warriors poured through the breach, their own howls joining his, a symphony of vengeance. The chamber erupted into chaos. Steel clashed against steel, the air filled with the scent of blood and magic. Malachor watched the battle with a cold, detached calm. As expected, he murmured. He turned his attention back to Alara, the obsidian knife held high. He is just in time for the final act. He plunged the knife down, not into her flesh, but into the air just above the glowing mark on her wrist. The magic of the blade struck the bond like a hammer blow. Alara screamed again as unimaginable pain ripped through her. It felt like her very essence was being torn in two. Through the bond, she felt Kaelin stagger, his roar turning into a howl of agony as he felt the same severing force. One of Malachor's lieutenants saw the opening and struck, a cursed blade slicing across Kaelin's flank. The great wolf stumbled, his golden eyes flickering with pain. Seeing him hurt, seeing him falter because of the pain she was sharing with him, shattered something deep inside Alara. The fear The years of submission, the belief in her own worthlessness, it all cracked. And from those cracks, something ancient and powerful and utterly furious surged forth. No. The word was a silent scream in her mind. You will not touch him. A wave of energy exploded from her body. It was not red and hot like the Covenant's magic, but a brilliant, blinding silver white, cold as the heart of a star. A wave of pure frostlight. The silver chains binding her vaporized into dust. The glowing runes on the floor were instantly extinguished, their dark magic erased. The acolytes were thrown back, their chant cut off as the wave of light and ice washed over them, freezing them where they stood, encasing them in shimmering, crystalline statues. Alara sat up on the altar, her body blazing with a light so bright it was painful to look at. The mark on her wrist was no longer a gentle glow. It was a miniature sun. Her eyes, once a timid gray, now shone with the same silver-blue luminescence. Ice crystals formed in the air around her, swirling in a delicate, deadly dance. Malachor stared at her, his composure finally breaking, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. What is this? Lyra was frozen in terror, her triumphant smirk gone, replaced by abject fear. It's not possible, she stammered. She's an Omega. She's nothing. Alara rose to her feet, her gaze locking onto Malachor. The power coursing through her was intoxicating, a wild, beautiful storm that answered only to her will. She felt Kaelin's awe and pride surge through the bond, which was no longer tearing, but thrumming with her newfound strength. You called me a ghost, she said, her voice no longer a whisper, but a clear, ringing command that cut through the sounds of battle. You were right. You just never realized a ghost is something that ought to be feared. She looked at Lyra, whose face had gone pale. You called me worthless. She turned her burning gaze back to Malachor. You called me a key. I am none of those things, she declared, raising a hand. A spear of pure, solidified light formed in her grasp, crackling with frost. I am Alara, and I am his. She looked past Malachor to Kaelin, who was now back on his feet, his wounds already closing, his golden eyes filled with an overwhelming love and reverence. He met her gaze and dipped his massive wolf head in a gesture of acknowledgement, of partnership. And he, she finished, her voice dropping to a low, dangerous whisper as she faced Malachor again, is mine. Malachor snarled, recovering his nerve. He gathered his shadow magic, forming a shield of darkness around himself. You are still just a girl, playing with power you cannot comprehend. He lunged, his obsidian knife aimed at her heart. Alara did not flinch. She met his charge, not with brute force, but with grace. She sidestepped his clumsy attack and brought her spear of light around. She did not try to shatter his shield, but to purify it. The frostlight touched the darkness and the shadows screamed. They did not break. They dissolved, turning to ash and smoke under the cleansing power of her light. Malachor's shield evaporated, leaving him exposed. It is you who does not comprehend, she said, her voice calm. You think power is something to be taken, but true power is something you are. She pressed the tip of her light spear against his chest. He cried out as the pure energy burned him, searing away his dark magic at its source. He fell to his knees, convulsing, his power unraveling. Kaelin was there in an instant, shifting back to his human form. He stood beside Alara, a united front of light and shadow. He placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent message of support, before turning his furious golden gaze on the kneeling Malachor. "You threatened my mate," Kaelin's voice was lethally quiet. "You tried to break our bond. You tried to steal her soul." He drew a long, elegant blade from a sheath on his back that hadn't been there a moment before. "For that, there is no forgiveness." The blade fell. The battle was over. Silence descended on the tower, broken only by the whistling of the wind. The surviving Covenant soldiers had either fled or surrendered to Kaelin's warriors. The immense power that had flooded Alara's veins receded, leaving her feeling shaky and exhausted, but vibrantly, truly alive for the first time. She swayed on her feet. Kaelin was there before she could fall, sweeping her into his arms. He held her tight against his chest, burying his face in her hair. She could feel the frantic, relieved beating of his heart against her cheek. "You are safe," he murmured into her hair, his voice thick with emotion. "I have you." "You were hurt," she whispered, her hand coming up to touch the place on his side where the cursed blade had struck. The wound was gone, but she could still feel the phantom ache of it through the bond. He pulled back just enough to look at her, his hands framing her face. His golden eyes were shining with unshed tears. "I have never been more proud in all my long years. I saw you, Alara, truly saw you. You were magnificent." For the first time, when someone praised her, she believed it. She had done it. She had saved him. She had saved herself. "I am the other half of your soul," she said, the words feeling true on her tongue for the first time. A smile, the first she had ever seen on his harsh, beautiful face, transformed him. It was like the sunrise. "Yes," he breathed. "You are." He leaned in and captured her lips with his. The kiss was not rough or demanding, but full of reverence, a testament to centuries of loneliness and a moment of triumphant reunion. It was a seal, a promise, a homecoming. As their lips met, the bond between them flared, brighter than ever before. Alara reached up, touching the frostlight mark on her wrist. Then, with a newfound confidence, she pressed her palm flat against the hard muscle of his chest, right over his heart. She pushed her own power, her own essence into him, a claiming, an acceptance. Kaelin gasped against her mouth as a matching mark, a sun of intricate frost, burned itself into existence on his skin, right beneath her hand. It glowed with the same silver-blue light, a perfect counterpart to her own. The bond was no longer just his claim on her, but hers on him. It was whole, complete, equal. They broke the kiss, breathless, and simply looked at each other, their matching marks pulsing in a gentle, synchronized rhythm. Kaelin's warriors had secured the tower. One of them approached, bringing Kaelin's cloak, which he immediately wrapped around Alara's shoulders. His gaze fell upon Lyra, who was being held by two grim-faced guards, her face a mess of tears and terror. "What is to be done with the traitor?" his second-in-command asked. Alara looked at the girl who had made her life a living hell. She saw no satisfaction in her fear, only a pathetic emptiness. She had the power to destroy her, to demand any punishment she saw fit. But she was not Lyra. She was not Malachor. "Exile her," Alara said, her voice clear and steady. "Let her wander the wastes as a lone wolf. Let her learn what it means to be truly alone." It was a fate worse than death for a pack creature, a punishment of quiet, unending misery that fit the crime perfectly. Kaelin nodded, his eyes glowing with approval. "As the Queen commands." Queen. The word hung in the air, heavy and unbelievable. Their return to his capital, the Silver Citadel, was a stark contrast to her flight from it. She rode with him, held secure in his arms on the back of a great stallion. His people lined the streets, their faces filled with awe and curiosity. They had heard the stories of the Alpha King's fated mate, the Omega who wielded the light of a frozen star. He led her into the throne room, a vast hall of white marble and glittering crystal that seemed to have been carved from the heart of a glacier. His entire court was assembled, the most powerful alphas from every corner of the kingdom. He led her up the dais to the two massive thrones, one of dark polished wood, the other of gleaming moon-white stone. He did not ask her to stand beside him. He guided her to the white throne and bid her to sit. Alara hesitated, the old habits of worthlessness whispering in the back of her mind. This was too much. It wasn't for her. Kaelin seemed to sense her doubt. He knelt before her, taking her hand in his, and looked up at her, his golden eyes blazing with absolute devotion for all his court to see. "For centuries this throne has been empty," he said, his voice ringing with power and clarity. "For centuries, our kingdom has had a king, but no heart, no balance." He raised her hand, showing the glowing mark on her wrist to the assembled crowd. "No more. The prophecy is fulfilled. The wait is over." He rose and stood beside her, turning to face his people. "I present to you Alara, the Frostlight Queen, my mate, my equal, your queen." A collective gasp went through the hall, followed by a deafening roar of approval. They stomped their feet and beat their chests, their howls of fealty shaking the very foundations of the citadel. Alara looked out at the sea of faces, not with fear, but with a dawning sense of peace. She looked at Kaelin, who had turned back to her, his eyes filled with a love so profound it stole her breath away. She was no longer the ghost of Greyfall. She was not invisible. She was not worthless. She was a queen. She was a mate. She was loved. She had found her home.